Welcome to the Cooperation Science Network. I'm your host, Athena Aktipis, and today I am here with the wonderful Jerry Wilkinson at the Limberski Conference so that we can have a conversation about the history and the future of cooperation science. Jerry, welcome. I'm going to adjust our cameras so that everybody can see us a little bit better. Here we go. Great. Thank you so much for being here with us, Jerry.
My pleasure.
So, Jerry, you've been working in cooperation science for a very, very long time, and now you're continuing to work on a variety of questions and a variety of new methods that can be applied to cooperation science. So I was hoping that maybe you could start by kind of telling us where you began in your work in cooperation science, and then we can learn a little bit about the pathway that you took and how that intersects with some big questions in cooperation science.
Okay.
Start with where did your interest begin in cooperation and understanding cooperation?
As a student, undergraduate student, I went to the University of California, Davis, where I took a course from a primatologist named Peter Rodman and discovered that primates in particular do a variety of things that are quite fascinating. And he encouraged me to take a graduate course as an undergraduate because there was a book that had just come out at that time by someone named Ed Wilson titled Sociobiology. And that book, reading that book really motivated me to consider going on to graduate school and trying to contribute to this, what seemed to be an emerging field. And at that time, I had been an avid bird watcher, so I knew a fair bit about birds. Then I was learning about primates, but Peter actually discouraged me from going into primatology because he thought there was a variety of reasons that would make it a more challenging, more limiting direction to go. So he gave me some advice about different people to work with. Mm-hmm. I applied to different places. I ended up going to the University of California, San Diego, and worked with a husband and wife team named Jack Bradbury and Sandy Barenkamp. And they, at the time, were doing field studies on bats, both in Africa, West Africa, half of the year, and the other half of the year in Central America. So I visited their site in Central America and took a course in tropical ecology and started thinking I would be interested to work on bats. But initially I wasn't focused yet on cooperation.
So what was it about bats that you're like, I want to study these guys?
It had to do with having watched the primates at the Davis Primate Center, seeing them interact, groom each other. As I was in Costa Rica, I learned that vampire bats can feed each other, something I've been seen in captivity, never studied in the wild. So where I was actually located, there were a lot of vampire bats. And so I started trying to mark and watch the vampire bats. And at that time, they reminded me of the primates that I'd been seeing at Davis and became fascinated by their behavior and quickly learned that they do what is as cooperative a behavior as I think you can find, certainly in bats and in most other mammals, in that they will feed each other. And it became a thrill, really, for me and actually for other people that have helped me to continue to try to figure out why they do that.
So they have a level of sociality that is, kind of unrivaled in the natural world in a way.
They don't do, so the extreme is if you don't reproduce, you're reproductively altruistic. As far as we know, they don't do that, but they will go nearly that far. And I never witnessed it, but other people have witnessed them adopting offspring from others,
wow,
which is pretty close to being reproductively altruistic. And, they have a very complex social system. They live a very long time. So they are, among bats, I think no one would disagree, the most social bat that we know.
So there's like bats are amazing, and then vampire bats are like the most amazing of the bats. So you had to study them.
Yeah, I mean, it became then an easy sell to pursue that for a PhD, and I made some surprising discoveries at that time. And because they're vampire bats, I think people find them very appealing just as an organism. And when you learn about all the things they can do, it makes them even more appealing. But I have to admit, after I'd done that work, I wanted to do something different. So I didn't want to keep studying vampire bats. And I started doing other projects and worked on a variety of other bats, and some of which has been also focused on cooperation.
Yeah. Well, so for people who might not be familiar with the sort of classic bat studies that you did looking at food sharing, maybe you can just like say a little bit, like the 2-minute version of what you did and what you found with looking at food sharing in bats in your early work.
Yeah, so we worked in a natural population where the bats were feeding on, at that place, primarily horses, although they feed on horses and cattle. And we individually marked the animals so we could distinguish individuals with colored bands. We habituated them to light in their hollow tree roosts. And then we simply watched to see who was doing what to whom. And we would systematically do it so that we would quantitatively know what each individual do over time, very primate focused behaviors analysis, and observed individuals feeding each other, mothers feeding their offspring, and then on occasion, adult bats feeding other adult bats, always females. So males would never be fed unless they were young males. Adult males don't feed each other. And because we monitored for years, I had various techniques to estimate the relatedness. I knew who was related to whom. I also knew from lots of past censuses who had been together with whom, and it turned out that who had been together in the past was, from my data set, the best predictor of who was going to be fed, but relatedness was also part of the story. And then sort of this key observation was to do an experiment where we took animals out in captivity and kept them from feeding, put them back in with the group, and they would be fed. And even though we only did that for a 2-week period, over that 2-week span, they did it in a reciprocal way, which is, I think, what kind of combined together with the other evidence that we had, told a fairly compelling story that these animals seem to be doing something that is close to what at the time had been called reciprocal altruism, or reciprocity.
Yeah, well, and so to kind of place this in a historical context, right? At the time that you did those studies, the main debate was kind of, like if you see an example of cooperation, is it because of genetic relatedness that would lead to the evolution of cooperation, parental investment, things like that? Or is it reciprocity? So some sort of payback that's happening. Some, I help you, you help me, I scratch my back, you scratch yours, right? Those were sort of the two frameworks for cooperation that were accepted at the time. And so any example of cooperation, the question was, which kind is it? So you were kind of working in that sort of context, right?
Very much. And I would say at that time, the only other case of within species reciprocity that I think people were fairly persuaded by were Craig Packard had observed coalitions of baboons and working together, alternating roles in acquiring mates in a very similar sort of reciprocal way. And that, at that moment in time, I think was the primary other example that was out there. But there were not a lot. I mean, so it was dominated by kinship explaining everything.
Yeah, so adding sort of this realm of, you can have social relationships that are cooperative, that are based on other things than just being relatives was quite new at that moment.
Yeah, I mean, it became something I think people wanted to believe at that moment in time because, humans are very good at this kind of reciprocal exchange. And to think that there are other animals, and there might even be bats, was appealing. Although I think the appeal eroded over time, which is interesting.
Why is that, you think?
That's a good question. There was clearly, when it first came out, a lot of attention and continued, but then I guess some of the reasons why that various people were doing experiments, particularly David Stevens did a study on blue jays where he trained them to sort of do something in a reciprocal way, and they would not continue to reciprocate. They quickly sort of adopted the selfish alternative, and so there's evidence that animals can't keep track. So how are they possibly doing this? They can't count. How are they knowing who's going to needs to be repaid? So I think there is that, and some other experiments sort of led the sort of groundswell of doubt that crept into the literature.
Right. So if you're going to have a sort of account keeping kind of reciprocity, you have to be able to keep accounts. You have to be able to keep track of, what I gave you, what you gave me, who owes who what. But there are other ways, right, that you can have positive social interactions among individuals who are not relatives.
Yes, and I think part of the reason that the sort of account keeping idea was being put forward is because the vampire bat story had been sort of adopted as a poster child for tit for tat reciprocity, this sort of very much keeping track, and I think that's what people were focused on. That that can't possibly be true. But I agree. I mean, there clearly are other ways that animals can influence each other and over time begin to share. And we've now learned a lot more about the vampire bat.
Yeah. So, how is that developed, this idea of, you don't necessarily need to have strict account keeping for these systems to work, and they might not, be based necessarily on, a tracking of who gave what to whom, but on something else.
Yeah, I don't know that we still understand exactly what the animals are doing, but what fortunate for me is that I was able to attract the graduate student now who came after having learned about this as a student in the class, became fascinated by vampire bats, actually met me, and I didn't realize he was an undergraduate, and then he came to do graduate work and wanted to redo the vampire bat work, and did so.
His name also just happens to be Jerry.
Yeah, I didn't recruit him for this. Happy to say.
Like, I'm looking for another Jerry who's interested in bats.
Jerry Carter, and he's done some phenomenal work, and is still doing some phenomenal work, and it was amazing because he has read my papers and knows them better than I do. I mean, he can cite word for word pretty much everything I've ever written about the vampire bats, and now he's done a lot initially with a large population of captive animals, where he can do many, many more of these fasting trials, and was able to show that they will feed each other in a way that is clearly not keeping track of individual exchanges, but depends on their past association. And what exactly that means, I mean, we've used the term bonds, social bonds, because I think that's in the primate literature, but it's really, and there have been descriptions of us, of what the bats are doing as friends. Well, what's a friend? I mean, perhaps that's a reasonable description, but it's that they clearly distinguish individuals based on their prior associations and behave to them in a very sort of prosocial way. They are very helpful to individuals that they have those sort of relationships with, and they're often not relatives.
Yeah. Well, and we kind of understand what you mean if you say there's social bonds or there's sort of like friendship. It's like, oh, okay, well that explains why they're cooperating. But then you have to ask, well, what is a bond, or what is friendship, right? What's the function of it? Is it indexing something that we could operationalize more in order to really get at like what is happening in these relationships that make them more likely to be cooperative than other relationships?
Yeah, so there's, sort of on the behavioral side, how do you decide whether you have a friend or not? You could also ask maybe more mechanistically, what is biologically different about individuals and how do they change to sort of become friends? Behaviorally, we know that they also, just like primates, they spend a lot of time grooming each other, and that's correlated with whether they feed each other. So that's part of creating this friendship. They clearly can tell each other's voices apart. We can do experiments and show that they know each other by their sounds that they make, and that they make particular types of sounds when they are together in these groups. One experiment that Jerry did while he was a graduate student was that there was this suggestion that in a variety of animals, the neuropeptide oxytocin, which is involved in milk letdown during lactation, but it's also sort of associated with social bonds in rodents and other mammals. So we tried essentially allowing the bats to inhale oxytocin and quantify and control and to see what would happen, and that affected their grooming and their feeding. So they elevated their social grooming. So that the mechanism there seems to be similar to what people have seen in other mammals. Not like bats are totally unique. They share a lot of similar basic mammalian behaviors.
Yeah, so in terms of the underlying kind of, mechanistic physiological basis, maybe we have oxytocin and other neuropeptides that are underlying that. And then we can also ask the question, well, what is it that is activating that, right? So you mentioned grooming and like that, grooming, food sharing, that those might be increasing the levels of oxytocin. So then is oxytocin a sort of, or like the functioning of the oxytocin system, like a way of kind of keeping track of a relationship?
Possibly.
Yeah.
I don't know that we know. And they live a long time and they can acquire. I mean, one of the other experiments that Jerry's done more recently is that you can introduce bats who have never seen each other in the past, and initially they don't interact. So it takes months before they become willing to engage in these social behaviors, the grooming and then the food sharing. So that suggests that whatever's happening, it's taking considerable amount of time. It doesn't happen sort of immediately. The one thing that we've been doing in my lab that's not related to cooperation, although maybe it is looking at changes in DNA methylation, which is something that happens and causes genes to turn on and off during our lifetime.
Right, so this is the basics of sort of what's known as epigenetics, right? That
Exactly.
It's not just what the genes are that you have that determine how you manifest, right? Your phenotype, but also it's how those genes are getting expressed that make a big difference.
Yeah, because if you think about it, you've got various tissues in your body and they all grow at different points in time at different rates, and then they stop growing and then they perform different functions in a whole variety. So that means that different types of genes have to be controlled, but you have one genome. So what is changed? Something has to be changing.
Yeah.
That something is epigenetics, and we don't, to any extent, completely understand how that happens for any organism. But we're learning a lot. I mean, it's a very active area of investigation. The one thing we do know about bats, and pretty much every mammal, is that you can predict the animal's age by looking at the pattern of methylation across many, many sites in the genome. It's a very systematic change that occurs, and a very predictable change that occurs. And so that's the basis of what are called epigenetic clocks, which we can now use in bats and in other things.
And were you also doing some work on stress and?
Well, that's one of the things we're beginning to do is actually with vampire bats, with Jerry Carter's involvement, we're going to see to what extent social stress, manipulating their social groups, influences their DNA methylation profiles to try to get a handle on what is it that is involved.
Mhm.
And the technique we're using, we can say where in the genome are these changes occurring. So that at this point, we have the funding to do this, but we have yet to get any data
Yeah,
along
well,
those lines.
That's why we're talking about the future of cooperation science, right? So doing work on things like, are there ways that our social relationships affect our epigenetic programming, basically, right? Like that's fascinating to think that, could, get at some of these issues with cooperation by looking at gene expression directly.
Yeah, and the one thing that personally I've not wanted to do is sacrifice animals. I like to look at the living organism and watch its behavior over time. And the fact they live a long time makes them not tractable organisms for short-term studies, but we can take samples and not hurt the animal at all from samples from their wings and get a measure of this methylation pattern. So it's not, there's limitations like every technique, but there's also possibilities that I think we have yet to really fully understand.
Mm-hmm. Are there other things that you're sort of excited about in terms of the future of studying cooperation? I know that you've looked at, you're one of the few people who's like looked at cooperation on many different levels, right? You've also looked at within the genome, looked at, conflict and cooperation and how that manifests in the genome and how that actually affects how organisms, the phenotypes of organisms.
Yeah, there's a lot of biology is a rapidly changing field, and there's a lot of sort of technological advances. This DNA methylation that I'm talking about is only possible if you have a completely sequenced genome for whatever organism you're working on. Mm-hmm. And so that is progressing at a very rapid pace. It's become much, much cheaper to generate full genome assemblies. And there's a group that's hopes to do at least 1,000 species of bats, and that's just the bats. Mm-hmm. There are various groups that are trying to sequence all vertebrates. So I think in our lifetimes, you will see full genomes, and that would allow people to ask a lot of questions that they haven't been able to ask until now, or until that happens. Including looking at in detail within the genome, what is changing that is sort of cooperative within the genome or not cooperative because of genetic elements that might be trying to move and change on their own.
Yeah, well, and we often just think of the genome as kind of like a static thing, right? It's the information that's there, but it's actually this unbelievably dynamic thing, not only because of epigenetics, which we've already talked about, which is, which genes are getting expressed or not, but because the actual structure of the genome, you have, all of these elements within that are basically, getting, like they're being suppressed from replicating and kind of taking over the genome, right? It's almost like you have it's like cancer of the genome, where you have these little pieces that if they could, they would just replicate all over the place and make the genome not functional at all. And so had to evolve all of these systems just to make a genome function as a collective unit.
Yeah, that's to me a really fascinating question. Is how do you keep that group of genes working together in a cooperative way and not be taken over by all the many other elements? The transposable elements are sort of the most obvious group of things that most organisms have. We keep them under control, except for in the case of, you say, cancer, because in cancerous tissues, the transposable elements often are expressed and they change. And that accelerates the process of mutation within those tissues. So it's, it is a very dynamic system that I think a lot of people don't appreciate. And, there's certain organisms where you can see that easier than others, but it's true of all multicellular life. It's not unique to us or anything else.
Yeah, it's almost like we kind of have a Russian doll of cooperation, right? It's like you know, look within the organism, you have all these cells, and all these cells are cooperating, and you look within the cells, and then you have, you know, all of these, you know, genes that are getting expressed in ways that make the cell, you know, able to function, and you have all of these mechanisms to actually make the genome cooperate. So you really have all of these different layers, and yeah, they can affect each other, right? Which is the the part that makes it really complicated sometimes to figure out what's going on. Is you've got all this conflict that's getting, you know, suppressed, so that you can have cooperation on all these levels. But then if things start falling apart on one level, then that can have these knock-on effects that affect, you know, everything up through the organism and even the ecosystems that they're embedded in.
Yeah, and it's a little daunting to try
It
to
is,
go
yeah.
to that level of scale.
Yeah.
But looking forward, I mean, there's no doubt that there will be new discoveries made. I think, you know, just in my lifetime, almost all of those things that we just talked about have been discovered, and and they are, I would say, the rate at which new things are being discovered is probably increasing. And so, in some ways, it's both extremely exciting to be a sort of new biologist entering the field. It's like all this stuff that you can now do that we couldn't do very easily. But it's also daunting because you got to literally understand quite a bit in order to sort of grapple with the where is the next thing that you want to try to answer.
Right, right. Well, and I mean, I feel like maybe that's a broader issue with science, is like the, you know, the more, you know, body of knowledge we build, the more you have to know in order to kind of take the next logical steps. But there's also, I mean, there's so much interdisciplinary space too that hasn't really been explored, right? And kind of that's what a lot of us are doing here, you know, with cooperation science, the Cooperation Science Network, with the University Conference where we are, is saying, okay, you know, in this interdisciplinary space where, you know, people are studying cooperation in different systems, can we bring that knowledge together in order to kind of fill in those gaps? And maybe there's still some, you know, low-hanging fruit, so to speak, or blood meals to be shared that could give us some insights. So.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, a question that I have not actively pursued myself but others try to answer, is to what extent do the things we've talked about so far, the bats or even other mammals, really tell us something about us as humans. And I find studying humans, the thought of studying humans, to be particularly challenging, because humans can do things that most other mammals can't. And there are also, you know, I think there's challenges associated with coming up with either experiments or, you know, influences of other variation among societies that I have to look to others. I mean, I'm not sure if, you know, I can provide a lot of insight, I mean, but it's very common for me to be asked, you know, what do the bats have to do with humans? And, you know, the one other bat system that we have studied, and we are still studying, is a nice contrast to the vampire bats. I can say a little bit about it. It's second biggest bat that's found in the New World down in South America. And they are omnivorous, so they eat all sorts of things, small vertebrates, fruit, nectar. But they form social groups by females leaving where they were born, and then going out and finding another group, initially of same-age females, like a little sorority, and staying together the rest of their lives, which can be over 20 years. And they are very social to, or very, you know, strongly associated with that group. And males then attempt to fight with each other to control access to that group of females, and will stay with them for a few years, and then they, we think, die and are replaced by another male. But they also will cooperate. They don't share food the way the vampire bats do, but they do other things that are pretty remarkable. And so we're also looking at social stress in that groups where we know relatedness is not a factor in the wild, which is not true in vampire bats.
Yeah. Well, we have a question from the audience here. So Andrew's asking if there have been experiments with food sharing and ABPR1A, which is associated with social system bonding in voles and some primates. So what do we know about food sharing? And is this a vasopressin receptor? ABPR?
Yeah, I think that's the receptor. And so it's too bad Jerry Carter's not here because I know that he took some of the bats that he did careful monitoring of the food sharing and shared them with a colleague at Cornell who has sectioned the brain. Because to look at the receptors, this is one of the things you've got to sacrifice the animal. And then you can stain slices of the brain and look at the distribution of the receptors, which is what has been done in voles. So I don't think we have the answer to that question yet, but it's something that hopefully we will have very soon.
Yeah, and that receptor has been associated with bonding in some other animals, right?
I know the vole works the best.
Okay, yeah.
But
What's been found there?
Well, so there's two types of voles, and the work that I'm familiar with is now a few years old, but it's prairie voles, which form social bonds, and meadow voles, which don't. I mean, there's sort of monogamous pairs in prairie voles, and there's polygyny in the meadow voles. And I can't tell you what part of the neuroanatomy where you get the concentration of the ABPR receptors, but there's a change in the distribution of the receptors in the brain of the prairie voles that seems to be associated with this pair bonding. And they've manipulated, done a variety of manipulations that kind of demonstrate that effect. And that was kind of how the oxytocin idea came to us. We didn't manipulate the receptors. I mean, every mammal has the same neuropeptide oxytocin. So very little, it's very short, it's like 9 amino acids. So we all have the same thing, but the distribution of the receptors in the brain affects the behavior of the animal. So that's what presumably is, we think, maybe different in vampire bats, possibly different between individuals that differ in their sharing behavior, but that's what we'll hope to see soon.
Right, great. Here, Lee Kronk says he's curious about male vampire bats. If they don't participate in food sharing, do they not survive as long as females?
So I think the answer to that is yes, they don't survive as long as females. However, that's from my own data where we had every animal marked. We were able to follow them for the time that I was there, and I went back several years later to look for them. So clearly, and prior people had banded vampire bats in the same place before I got there, and all the banded animals that I encountered were females that had been banded years before. So all of that made me think the males who leave at birth, or not leave at birth, sorry, leave when they become sexually mature, leave their social groups, disperse, then they fight with each other to gain access to where females roost most frequently. And there's a lot of male fighting. You catch males, they're ripped up, they've broken teeth. They're clearly a lot of effort goes into them trying to get to females to mate. The contrast, though, is that there's a long-term study in Argentina, just banded animals, where they recaught animals over many, many years, and they found no difference between males and females. So it was very different kind of data because mine was very, very detailed individual observations over continuous time. Theirs is just netting animals, but thousands of animals. So it's a big study. So I don't know whether that perhaps is a difference, or if you look more closely, maybe they would see the same pattern I saw. I mean, we had, again, animals that were 20 years old, vampire bats that had been recaught. No male, I banded just as many males as females. Nobody has caught males anywhere near that age from all the work I did. So I think yes.
And we have another question. When you look at scaling up of cooperation from cells to societies, could it be interpreted as a form of directionality in evolution? So very, very big kind of philosophical question. Is it, is this reflecting some sort of directionality of evolution or not?
Well, is there more? I guess at some levels I would have to say yes, it must be true, right? Because 4 billion years ago, we didn't have the kinds of social things that we have now. So that, but evolution, my understanding is it's based on sort of underlying mutations which generally occur fairly randomly. I think what you have to argue is that, cooperation in the long term is better than being selfish the majority of time. And if that's true, then yes, it's going to lead to some sort of directionality. But it's not an intentional directionality, it's the consequence of what we think of as Darwinian natural selection.
Right. So if there are opportunities for mutual benefit that can be realized if organisms are able to cooperate and coordinate, then natural selection is going to favor those. And you can get this sort of building up of these cooperative modules kind of into these things that are larger and larger, although not necessarily infinitely large.
No, but you can think of things, ants are maybe a good example where every ant is social and they have done really, really well. And there are some pretty large ant societies that have millions, if not perhaps even billions of individuals. But if you look across all insects or all mammals, you don't see of that, right? I mean, it's not like everything is social. So it is not universal.
Yeah. Well, and it kind of, brings up maybe a broader question since we are talking about sort of the history and the future of, thinking about cooperation science. For a very long time, the sort of dominant paradigm was that, cooperation is like impossible. Evolutionarily, it's not possible, right? Because if you cooperate, then you're going to be exploited and then, you'll be sort of weeded out by evolution. But this kind of approach of, looking at, even just a multicellular organism as, a manifestation of cooperation because you have cells that are working together, looking at, ant colonies as cooperation, it flips the script a little bit, right, on this idea that like cooperation isn't viable because you see cooperation making organisms a lot more viable.
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly you and I can agree that cooperation is not hard to find. It definitely occurs in many biological levels, in many systems, and I guess at one point you could argue that all multicellular organisms have can only exist because of all the cooperation that exists within their bodies. So yes, in that sense, it's ubiquitous, but when you get to some higher level of societies, then I don't think it is quite as ubiquitous. And then it becomes fascinating, why is it that some animals or even some societies differ in their level of cooperation? And I think that was back at the beginning of when I started, that was kind of the question that appealed to me, what is the difference? I don't know if I have an answer to that question, but it's still a pretty appealing question.
Yeah, well, so have any of the things that you found or, learned about or even read about from others' work changed your thinking over the course of decades that you've been working in this area? On this particular question, really.
Yeah, I came into that Wilson sociobiology, the sort of idea that kinship could explain a lot was really strong at that point in time. And I would say that I know people who felt like it explained everything. I mean, there was no need for any other explanation. And as time has gone on, I have felt like that has become less and less true. And I doubted it initially to some extent, but I wasn't sure. I thought perhaps we could explain the manifest by kinship. Maybe that was the whole story. And I started to doubt it myself, my own work. I know I saw what I saw. But as I've learned more about the different systems we've worked on and heard about other systems, it's become pretty clear to me that while kinship plays a role, it's not everything. And I think it's even more true probably for humans.
Mhm. Well, and our whole demographic structure, of human societies has changed a lot over, the last few hundred years, right? In terms of, in different societies too, different family sizes, and you have, very different social structures. You have maybe, after the demographic transition, fewer kin members in general that you can interact with. So there's more of a need then to have social relationships with non-kin to, help manage your risk or work together on large goals that you can't accomplish by yourself. So it's interesting to kind of think about, those changes in human society and then how they intersect with these explanations for cooperation as well.
Yeah, I mean, at least in Western industrialized countries, the sort of extended family system is far less common, right? And people don't necessarily stay where they were born. They're more likely to move into urban centers, and it breaks down the sort of traditional kinship associations that you see in less mobile, less industrialized societies.
Yeah.
And I've deferred to the primatologist with regard to how often do you get that sort of extended kinship in primate groups. The bats that we study, where there is kin, they do have that, but it's not, we don't have good evidence of sort of, grandmothers. We know these bats actually that I just talked about that are not kin do reach an age where they don't reproduce consistently. It's not like they stop reproducing, but they don't reproduce consistently. But they are still a member of the group. They do still participate in going out to find food, and the group goes to find the food together or share the information. And that suggests an advantage of having these older individuals that are not necessarily reproducing themselves. That's something that's not, I think there's a handful of other animals, killer whales and things that may be doing something similar, but not a lot, or at least we don't know of a lot.
Yeah. We have one more question here through the stream, and then we'll open it up for sort of broader discussion here in the room. So Stephen is asking about whether there are cases of aggressive competition over resources such as food and mate among vampire bats. Do they fight over resources?
Yes, I think I already mentioned that males will fight to get close to females, and I witnessed fights in a variety of situations. At night, so where I work, they were in hollow trees, the females are at the top of the tree, the males one male's with the females, other males are lower in the tree, and they fight with each other to move around within the tree. And at night, other males visit these trees and they try to get in, and also then will fight and presumably occasionally replace the sort of resident males. So that is pretty clearly fighting for access to the mates. And vampire bats are one of the few bats that don't have a seasonal reproductive period. So the female can be potentially receptive any month of the year, but they also give birth, and they're receptive shortly after they give birth. So males can be looking for receptive females all the time. We also know that fighting occurs on where they feed, on the cows, horses where they're feeding, but we don't have as many observations of who is fighting who, because you have to mark animals to know that. I know, because I watched animals that I marked, that the females don't fight with each other on the feeding sites, and they will sometimes sit there and feed together at the same food site, and they're from the same social group. That I know for sure. The fighting, I never saw that among marked animals, so I never knew. But presumably they're not part of the group that I was monitoring, because I had marked everybody. So they're probably an animal from different social group from some other location.
Interesting. Great. Well, at this point, we're gonna open it up for a broader discussion here in the room. And I'd like to invite anybody to ask a question for Jerry about his work or about the history of cooperation science and where we're going. Yeah, Denise.
Hi, thank you.
If you can speak up so the mics can catch you, yes.
Talk louder. You mentioned that they adopt like baby bats that aren't their own. Could you talk more about that? I know they like alloparent, right? They have little clutches and they'll take turns watching the whole clutch of baby bats, but they also adopt.
So vampire bats, most bats, I should say, form what are called crushes, where they will leave their young together and go off and feed and then come back. But because of what I just said, the vampire bats don't have a seasonal reproductive period. They don't give birth together. So they don't crush, they don't leave their pups together. In fact, I would go into these trees at night and sometimes see a couple pups just hanging there, and they're different ages usually, so they're not all the same age. So I never saw an adoption event. Several other people have witnessed this, and I'm assuming it's because the mother died and the pup was, left alone. It's all only been seen in captivity, which makes me suspect that makes it a little easier to adopt, because you need to be able to then produce enough milk to feed your young and another young. And we know, or I know, that vampire bats don't produce a lot of milk. And the blood is not an easy food source to turn into milk. It's and they produce, and it takes them, they grow very slowly. It takes them 9 months. They lactate for 9 months before the young are independent. So in the wild, I would think adoption would be really, really rare, because would be so, unless a female lost her own young and then was able to sustain the energetic demands of lactation. That probably happens pretty rare.
It looks like we have another question, yeah.
You talked about the relationship between food sharing and grooming, and building those food sharing networks with strangers. I was curious if the grooming is a necessary precondition to build that bond.
My guess is yes, although, we only have this sort of one, well, that's not entirely true. So Jared Carter, who did this experiment that I described yesterday, had multiple animals that he put together and then just followed them over this 10-month period and saw that pattern. I did one such experiment during my field work, where I went to Santa Rosa, this field site, and away from where I was working, and brought an animal back with a pup, because I figured that way she would stay, and introduced her into one of the groups that I was watching. And she stayed around for several weeks, but they were completely excluded from even roosting together. So they were isolated from the rest of the group. And so that doesn't necessarily answer the question, but that's the one observation I have from the field. But we know that there are multiple natural lines, so that means independent females do sometimes come together, and it must take some period of time. And they socially groom a lot compared to other bats that do that very rarely. And we always, I didn't emphasize, but when I saw food sharing, social grooming almost always preceded the actual food sharing event. And so it seems like it's a very sort of part of the creating this connection that they eventually have. So I would guess yes, they almost always would.
Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned in your presentation yesterday that they'll sometimes fight with each other to donate blood to a bat in need, but you also showed some moments when they refused to donate.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that happens when the bat that's asking for it maybe doesn't fully need it, and the other bat's sort of detecting that as a cheater, or what would be the scenario where that would happen?
Yeah, I don't think either. I mean, I had observations of sort of rejecting happening as well as Jerry Carter and his work. I don't think either of us have enough of those to really be able to say convincingly why that happens. The one thing that I also had that I didn't talk about is how much blood had everybody obtained in their prior feeding and then have available to feed. And I was able to show that only the animals that had sort of fed above average were willing to donate. And so that could be a reason why an animal would refuse to share, because they basically didn't have enough to share, or they, were less willing to share. But I don't think we have enough data to say that for sure, but that would be my guess.
Do we have other questions?
I have a big picture question, just kind of going back around to at the very beginning of the event, you mentioned Ed Wilson's book, Sociobiology.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, it's almost 50 years since that book came out.
Yeah.
How do you see its impact on?
Well, I'm sure you know that the last chapter of that book was fairly controversial, but to me that was sort of unfortunate, because the book really was amazing in all of the types of approaches that he put together in all the preceding chapters that had not really been integrated in that way before. And so, multiple journals came online after that, and there was, to me, the discipline that I grew up in, the sort of field that I feel I'm part of, all has happened since that book was published. And if the book hadn't been published, would that still have happened? Maybe, but I think it really did catalyze for a lot of people, not just me. But I don't think it's also, it has its, it's not perfect. It's got a lot of questions, even outside of the last chapter. You can debate various issues. So, and I think there's a lot of technology that we now have that wasn't available then, that has enabled many new questions. If you had to write another book along of that sort, what would it look like? It's not gonna be me. But it was a moment in time when really there was kind of this fascination, and he was an ant biologist. He kind of took what he knew about the ants and tried to then use that to explain the world. And ants are very kinship-oriented organisms, so it's not surprising that that's kind of major picture that came out of the book. But still, it was combining different lines of inquiry that I still think is pretty amazing.
Thanks.
Any last questions? Terry? Well, then I'll end this with one question, which is, what questions are you most excited to learn answers to with the new methods and approaches that are becoming available for studying cooperation and social behavior?
Well, my scientific career, I have had particular ideas about things that I thought might be true, that I thought I would try to test and see if that was true or not. And on more than one occasion, I've been completely surprised by something that I did not anticipate. This story I told yesterday about driving sex chromosomes. So there's nothing I'd ever thought of, and in fact that might have something to do with the morphology of these weird flies. I was completely surprised, but it's far more interesting than what I had been thinking. And so I just want to be open to whatever new discoveries make sense. I mean, I didn't know anything about epigenetic clocks 5 years ago. Now I know a lot, and I think we will learn a lot, but I don't want to predict what we're going to find, because I think we may be surprised.
So you're most excited by the things that will surprise you, that
By the unknown, by what we might learn. I think we try to train people to sort of have your hypotheses, test your hypotheses, but if you do that sort of without keeping an eye open for the unexpected, you're gonna miss what may be the most important finding. And so to me, that's still the fun of doing science.
That makes a lot of sense, right? And if you're just like, oh, I'm testing this hypothesis and you don't find evidence for that hypothesis, but you're not actually looking at what you are finding, you might just throw something away that could be the seed for an entirely new research program.
I completely think that's the best way to approach science.
Great. Well, Jerry, thank you so much for being with us here today to share your thoughts and ideas about both your work and the history and future of the field of cooperation science.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for joining us here at the Cooperation Science Network. We will see you again next time.